1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Break shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. Down a half. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about.
July 20th, 1969. The world watched in silence as a fragile insect-like machine settled onto the surface of the moon. Moments later, Neil Armstrong descended a narrow ladder and pressed his boot into lunar dust, delivering words that would echo through history. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. An estimated 600 million people witnessed the event live, making it one of the most watched broadcasts in human history. We remember it as a clean triumph, a flag standing still in the vacuum, a footprint preserved in gray soil, America victorious in the space race. But Apollo 11 was never that simple. Behind the calm voices and steady camera feeds were backup plans for catastrophe. The White House had prepared a speech in case Armstrong and Aldrin were stranded on the moon. During the final descent, onboard computers issued overload alarms that could have forced an abort. Apollo 11 succeeded, but it succeeded on the edge of failure. And decades later, strange details still raise questions about what really happened during those tense hours in July 1969. Before we begin, if you appreciate deep, fact-driven documentaries that go beyond the headlines, consider subscribing. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the details history often leaves behind. Apollo 11 did not begin with exploration. It began with pressure. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. The event stunned the United States. If the Soviets could send a satellite into orbit, they could potentially send nuclear weapons across continents. Space had become a strategic frontier. The tension intensified in April 1961 when Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. Just weeks later, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress with an ambitious declaration. The United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely before the decade ended. At the time, this promise bordered on the impossible. Computers filled rooms and had less processing power than a modern calculator. Rocket launches frequently failed. NASA itself was only 3 years old. Apollo 11 was not simply a scientific mission, it was a geopolitical statement, a demonstration of technological dominance during the Cold War. But when national pride meets extreme engineering, the margin for error becomes dangerously thin. And Apollo 11 would discover just how thin that margin truly was. Because once Apollo 11 left Earth, the mission was no longer political. It was personal. Every calculation mattered. Every decision carried consequences. And as the spacecraft traveled toward the moon, a series of moments unfolded that rarely make it into the simplified version of history. Moments of near failure, moments of silence, moments where the outcome was far from certain. This is where the polished narrative begins to fracture. To understand Apollo 11 fully, we have to step inside those hours, inside the cockpit, inside mission control, and examine the strange details that never quite made sense. 1. The speech that was never delivered. On July 20th, 1969, while millions celebrated the possibility of a successful moon landing, the White House prepared for something far darker. Tucked inside presidential archives is a document titled "In Event of Moon Disaster." It was written by presidential speechwriter William Safire at the request of the Nixon administration. The speech was meant to be delivered if Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became stranded on the lunar surface with no hope of return, U.S. National Archives. The plan was stark. If the lunar module failed to lift off, communication with the astronauts would eventually be cut. A clergyman would commend their souls to the deepest of the deep, and the president would address the nation, honoring them as men who gave their lives in mankind's most noble goal. The existence of this speech was not paranoia. Engineers knew the mission carried enormous risk. The ascent engine that would lift the lunar module off the moon had never been tested in that exact environment. Apollo 11 succeeded. The speech was never read. But the fact that it was written reminds us of something sobering. Triumph was never guaranteed. For a brief moment in July 1969, the world stood on the edge between glory and tragedy. 2. The alarms that nearly ended the landing. As the lunar module Eagle began its final descent toward the moon's surface, everything appeared calm. Armstrong and Aldrin were focused. Mission control in Houston was steady. Then, without warning, an alarm sounded. 1202. Neither astronaut immediately understood what it meant. Seconds later, another alarm. 1201. In the confined cockpit, tension rose instantly. These were computer program alarms, signals that the onboard Apollo guidance computer was overloaded. If the computer failed, the landing would have to be aborted. Back in Houston, Guidance Officer Steve Bales had only moments to decide. Engineers quickly determined that although the computer was overwhelmed, it was still prioritizing essential landing functions. They gave the call, "Go." The decision was not casual. If they were wrong, the mission could fail. The overload was later traced to radar data flooding the computer with extra information, pushing it beyond expected capacity. The lunar module continued descending. History remembers the famous words after touchdown. But just minutes before that moment, Apollo 11 came dangerously close to being aborted. Not by fuel, not by weather, but by a struggling computer with less memory than a modern calculator. 3:30 seconds from aborting history. The computer alarms were not the only threat during Apollo 11's landing. As Neil Armstrong manually guided the lunar module away from a field of large boulders, something else was running out. Fuel. The automated landing system had targeted an area later identified as unsafe. Armstrong took manual control, flying horizontally to find a smoother location. But every second of maneuvering consumed precious propellant. Inside mission control, calculations became urgent. The call came through 60 seconds. Then, moments later, 30 seconds. This was not cinematic exaggeration. NASA flight records confirmed that the lunar module was approaching its fuel safety limit. Had it reached a critical threshold, an automatic abort would have been triggered. When Armstrong finally transmitted, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Only seconds of usable fuel remained." Estimates vary slightly, but NASA documentation indicates that as little as 20 to 30 seconds of fuel was left before abort criteria would have forced a climb back to orbit. The landing succeeded, but it succeeded on a razor's edge, with almost no margin for error. 4. The most isolated man in human history. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, a third astronaut remained alone in orbit. Michael Collins, command module pilot of Columbia, did not step onto the lunar surface. Instead, he circled the moon repeatedly, passing behind it every orbit, completely cut off from communication with Earth and his crewmates. During those roughly 48 minutes on the moon's far side, Collins was the most isolated human being in history. No radio contact, no visual of Earth, no reassurance. He later wrote in his autobiography, Carrying the Fire, that he felt neither fear nor loneliness, but responsibility. If anything went wrong during ascent, if the lunar module failed to rendezvous, he would have no choice but to return to Earth alone. Without Collins, the mission could not succeed. The command module was the only way home. History celebrates the first footsteps. But Apollo 11 was a three-man mission, and for every moment Armstrong stood on the moon, Collins carried the weight of bringing them back. He may not have walked on the moon, but without him, no one would have returned from it. 5. The missing original Moonwalk. Tapes. One of the strangest and most persistent mysteries surrounding Apollo 11 is not about what happened on the moon, but about what happened to the footage. The images the world saw on July 20th, 1969 were transmitted using a special format called slow scan television, SSTV. These original recordings were significantly higher quality than the converted broadcasts that aired live on television, NASA. However, in the early 1980s, NASA discovered something troubling. The original SSTV tapes were missing. After years of investigation, NASA concluded in 2009 that the tapes were likely erased and reused during a period when magnetic data tapes were expensive and in short supply. At the time, no one anticipated the long-term historical value of the raw recordings. NASA Press Conference, 2009. The footage we have today is a lower quality copy created by filming the broadcast on monitors. There is no evidence of foul play. But the fact remains, the clearest original recording of humanity's first steps on the moon no longer exists. For some, that loss fuels suspicion. For historians, it reflects something simpler: bureaucracy, budget constraints, and a failure to recognize history in the moment it was being made. 6. The waving flag. Mystery. One of the most debated images from Apollo 11 is simple: the American flag appearing to ripple on the moon. For skeptics, the question is immediate. The moon has no atmosphere, no wind. So why does the flag look like it's moving? The answer lies not in air, but in physics. The flag was not an ordinary cloth on a pole. NASA engineers designed it with a horizontal support rod along the top so it would appear extended in the airless lunar environment. NASA Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. Without wind, fabric would otherwise hang straight down. When Armstrong and Aldrin twisted the pole into the lunar soil, they caused vibrations in the fabric. In a vacuum, there is no air resistance to dampen motion, so the flag continued oscillating briefly before settling. NASA, Smithsonian Air, and Space. In photographs, shadows and creases can create the illusion of movement even when the flag is still. There is no verified evidence that wind existed on the moon during the mission. The flag did not wave because of air. It moved because it had been touched. Sometimes what appears mysterious is simply unfamiliar physics, viewed through the lens of a world we understand differently. 7. The missing stars in the sky. Another persistent question about Apollo 11 photographs is this: if the astronauts were standing on the moon, why don't we see stars in the sky? The lunar surface has no atmosphere. There is no light pollution. Logically, the sky should be filled with stars. But photography does not work the way human eyesight does. The surface of the moon, especially under direct sunlight, is extremely bright, comparable in exposure to a desert at noon on Earth. To properly capture astronauts and lunar terrain, cameras were set to fast shutter speeds and narrow apertures. Stars are vastly dimmer than sunlit lunar soil. With the exposure settings used during Apollo 11, starlight simply did not register on film. This effect is not unique to space. Even on Earth, if you photograph a brightly lit object at night using daylight exposure settings, stars will disappear from the image. There is no verified evidence that stars were absent from the lunar sky. They were there. They were simply too faint to appear under the exposure conditions required to document the mission. What looks suspicious at first glance often reveals itself through physics and optics. After completing their moonwalk, Armstrong and Aldrin returned inside the lunar module Eagle to rest before liftoff. That's when something unexpected happened. Inside the cramped cabin, Aldrin accidentally bumped into a small but critical component, the circuit breaker switch that would ignite the ascent engine, the very engine needed to lift them off the moon and rendezvous with Michael Collins in orbit. The switch broke. Without that engine firing, they would be stranded. The ascent engine had no backup ignition system. If it failed, there was no rescue plan. According to Aldrin's later accounts, he realized that the broken switch still had a small opening where a conductive object might activate it. Using a felt-tip pen he had in his pocket, not a high-tech tool, but a simple pen, he carefully pushed the circuit breaker back into place. Aldrin, Magnificent Desolation, NASA Oral History Project. The engine fired successfully. There is no evidence this was widely dramatized at the time. It was simply one more quiet moment of risk inside a mission filled with them. Apollo 11 is remembered as flawless. But in truth, it survived through preparation, quick thinking, and, at least once, a pen. We remember Apollo 11 as certainty. A footprint, a flag, a few unforgettable words. But it was never certain. A death speech waited in the White House. Computer alarms flashed during descent. Fuel nearly ran out. A small broken switch almost changed history. Apollo 11 was not flawless. It was fragile, and that is what makes it remarkable. Because greatness is not the absence of danger. It is the courage to move forward despite it. 3 men left Earth with no guarantee of returning. Millions watched. Engineers calculated. Leaders prepared for tragedy. And somehow, on the edge of failure, humanity succeeded. Apollo 11 was more than a moon landing. It was proof that even in uncertainty, we can reach farther than we ever imagined.